Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I am going to do kind of a fast and furious review of the final exam homework review for Economic History of the United States. I'm not in my office and I don't have all my normal pen colors, but I want to make sure I get this review out to you guys just so you have a resource. There's just not a lot of videos I have posted for this channel yet, and so I wanted to give you guys some feedback and some insight into some of those homework review problems as we get ready for that final exam. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly and a little bit awkwardly, but I think it's a good way to review some of this material. And so we have three main questions we're going to talk about in this chapter or in this review question. The first question was about the Taylor principle or the Taylor rule, how it plays a role in contractionary monetary policy and output and inflation. The next question is about regressive, proportional, and progressive tax structures and how it contributes to things like the Great Compression and the Great Divide. And then a question specifically about the Great Compression, its causes, and a little bit of a review of labor demand. And then we have a question about statistical discrimination, looking at how statistical discrimination can impact employees. And then the last question is about the self-selection model of immigration. So the first question looks at that Taylor rule, and it says, intuitively explain how the failure to follow the Taylor principle can lead to accelerating inflation when there's a positive shock to aggregate demand that leads to higher output and inflation. And the basic idea here is that the Taylor rule is looking specifically at, does this make it better or worse? Let me see. It's looking specifically at the trade-offs between, or this relationship between real and nominal interest rates. That doesn't seem to make too much of a difference. And so when we're looking at real versus nominal interest rates, what we want to remember is that nominal interest rates are the interest rates we see in the market, and then the real interest rates are controlled for inflation or adjusted for inflation. So the real interest rate, R, is going to be equal to the nominal interest rate minus inflation. And the textbook uses pi for inflation, but we can write it down here that the real interest rate is really just the nominal interest rate minus inflation. You guys even read that orange? Probably not. All right, we'll stick to darker colors. So for example, if we have a real interest rate, if we have a nominal interest rate of 7%, and we find out that inflation was 3%, then that means that we're going to have a real interest rate of 7 minus 3. And this is just taking into consideration the purchasing power of that interest that's being paid. So we'll have a real interest rate of 4% because 7 minus 3 is 4. Now we want to remember that the whole point of contractionary monetary policy is that the Federal Reserve, that's not how you spell monetary, is that the Federal Reserve is going to try to increase the real interest rates in order to reduce investment spending by companies and consumption spending by individuals in order to shift aggregate demand in, trying to slow the economy down, reduce inflationary pressures. But if we're experiencing inflation, we want to make sure that we're actually lowering this real interest rate and not just targeting the nominal interest rate ineffectively. So let's go ahead and imagine a world where our contractionary monetary policy is going to try to reduce the interest rate or raise the interest rate. We want to raise the interest rate up to, say, 8%. It's a small increase in the interest rate. And that's great. And if inflation stays the same, then we will have actually increased the real actual interest rate to 5%. But if we're worried about inflationary pressures enough to be slowing the economy down with contractionary monetary policy, then it's probably not going to stay the same. It's probably going to be going up. if it's going up by the same amount, then our real interest rate is actually staying the same. Or if it's going up by more because it's inflationary pressure we're worried about, then our 1% increase might only actually be a decrease in the real interest rate. And we assume that even though the nominal interest rate is what people see, we're responding to real variables because we're paying attention to the purchasing power. So the Taylor principle says, hey, you got to raise the nominal interest rate by more than the inflation, or you're not going to have effective policy, right? 3 is not more than 4 because inflation took out all of the power of that interest rate increase. The other part of the question asks about inflationary pressure of rising prices. And the idea there is, okay, so let's say this happens. Now interest rates are lower. Those lower real interest rates are going to mean that people are going to say, wow, borrowing got cheaper in real terms. I'm going to increase investment spending, increase consumption spending, and we're going to see aggregate demand shift out. The problem is, when aggregate demand shifts out, we tend to see inflation increase. And that's going to give us this effect. As inflation increases, it's going to keep decreasing that real interest rate. Even if the nominal interest rate stays the same, if we see inflation continue to increase, maybe now it's at 6%, now the real interest rate is already down to 2%. That's going to keep driving up investment and consumption spending, because now we're back at the beginning of the cycle. We're going to see that stuff increase, shifting aggregate demand out, increasing inflation, and continuing on over and over again. And so this is why we see, for example, in the great inflation era with the Volcker deflation, Chair Paul Volcker had to really drive that nominal interest rate up to make sure he was outpacing inflation so that he didn't get stuck here. And that's the value of the Taylor principle, sometimes called the Taylor rule, is that we want to make sure that our contractionary monetary policy is targeting a real interest rate that is beating out that inflation, so we're having a real effect. Because we can't actually see those real interest rates. We see the nominal interest rate, and then we look back and say, ooh, inflation was pretty high. So that's the big idea there. The next question on the review, where'd it go? There it is. Asks about regressive and progressive and proportional tax systems. And the idea here is that we have 3 kinds of tax systems. We have tax policies where we tax wealthy people more than poor people. We have tax policies where we tax poor people more than wealthy people. And then we have the proportional system where we tax everyone the same regardless of income. And so we can think about it as kind of looking graphically like this. If we have a proportional, and this is kind of similar to that graph that we saw in chapter 13, I think it's figure 13.6, where we look at the distribution of income in the US, and then we look at the overall tax rate. And so a progressive tax structure would be a tax structure where the tax rate increases as income increases. We are progressively taxing wealthy people more than poor people. A regressive tax rate would be one where the burden is on low-income people. And we are taxing poor people more than wealthy people. The other is the proportional tax rate where everyone is taxed the same regardless of their income level. And we've seen this change over time, and that graph, it's figure 13.6 in your textbook and in the slides, does a really good job of articulating it. They look at all the taxes for the whole US. And we see that over time, we used to have a much more, We used to have a much more progressive tax structure, and now we have a pretty proportional tax structure with just a teensy bit of regressiveness at the end. And so that's going to contribute to wealth and income inequality, because if we're taxing wealthy people more, we're getting a lot more money from it. And if we tax them less, we have to either make up that income somewhere else or cut spending on programs that usually tend to be redistributive. So we can think about how that might have the structure of our taxes. It's going to affect income and wealth inequality over time in the US. And this leads right into the Great Compression. The Great Compression was a period of declining wealth and income inequality in the United States from 1929 to 1953. There's a lot of explanations. Some of them are policies, some of them are just facts of history. We had progressive income taxes, growing union membership, wage and price controls, increased investment in human capital, increased demand for less skilled labor following World War II, and the Great Migration. And so we can look at some of these in the supply and demand framework to help us get a better sense of how that plays out. I'm just going to make sure you guys can still see me. And so when we think about what that might look like, we can see a supply and demand framework as an example of some of these. Some of them aren't going to be super duper labor market-y things, but if we think about the market for labor and the idea that wages are part of it, we want to remember that labor markets, the demand for labor, is derived from the value marginal product of labor. And so how much people make is going to be a function of how many workers are in the labor market and the productivity of those workers. So if we start out with some kind of initial condition, we can say things like, oh, well, increased investment in human capital. One of the things we had was free and low-cost college, and that meant that workers were more productive. It increased the marginal productivity of those workers. That shifted that value marginal product of labor curve up, meaning they had higher wages. We can also think about how the increased demand for less skilled workers, our growth in manufacturing, and the fact that those manufacturing jobs tended to be really good jobs where people earned wages that would support a whole family. That's part of this here. I'm trying to get rid of this glare, and I'm doing a terrible job of it. Is that going to work? Nope. Let's try this. I don't know if you guys can see that. Oh, there we go. Worse, better, kind of better. All right. So really what we're seeing here is the labor demand changing because of investments in human capital, because of things like the GI Bill and low or no cost education, higher education. We can also talk about things like the Great Migration, where we saw workers in the South, specifically black workers in the South, facing high unemployment. The creation of minimum wage laws meant that there was really high unemployment in the South, and so they moved to places where labor demand was much higher, and that was going to have an impact on their wages overall. We can also talk about things like wage and price controls, right? Regulations like minimum wage laws that increased wages and pushed it up. We can also talk about things like the union membership. Unions tend to raise wages above equilibrium, and that's going to tend to increase the wage for workers, making them more money. It also tended to include benefits and worker protections that meant greater job security for those workers. Other things that we could talk about, we had a decrease in the labor supply. World War II meant that a lot of workers didn't come home, and that decreased the supply of labor, which is also going to increase wages. We also saw an increase in affordability because of price protections. We also saw unions protect workers against exploitation, and a lot of those factors really helped increase income for middle and low-class Americans and decrease the income and wealth disparities. The other thing was the progressive tax structure meant it was all paid for with taxes that came from the wealthiest Americans, and that really helped too. Cool? The next one, I'm going to make sure to use the black marker for this because this is an equation. We're looking at a statistical discrimination problem where we have a new employer is giving workers a test to determine their wages, but the employer engages in statistical discrimination. And so let me get this problem up here. Remembering statistical discrimination is when expectations about a group characteristic are going to have an effect on wages. So in this example, wages are a function of the test a worker takes that predicts their productivity and their group score, or the expectations about the group, G. And so in this example, we have brown-haired and black-haired workers, and I'm just going to throw this up here. Brown-haired workers are expected to have a group score, or are given a group score by the discriminating employer of 14, while black-haired workers are given a group score of 18. The first question asks us to just estimate the wages for a worker with black hair and scoring a 16 on the test. And so for that one, we just plug and play. So we've got a test score of 16. And because this applicant has black hair, they're going to have a group score of 18. So that's going to give us a wage of 8 plus 9, or 17. So far, so good. Now the next question says, suppose the employer uses the same formula and the wages for both types of workers are identical. In this case, is anyone facing discrimination? And we can use this equation to figure this out because what we're going to find is, yeah, they are. So long as the employer has differences in their beliefs about how productive the workers are and determining wages based on that, it's going to be discriminatory. So if we look at this example, let's say we set them equal. So we have this worker, worker A, and this is a black-haired worker with a test score of 16. So now we want to see what would the test score have to be for an equivalent brown-haired worker. So we can just set up the equation and say, let's assume the wage is going to be that same 17 as above, but now we're solving for the test score the brown-haired worker would have to get in order to earn the same wage. And so we're going to go ahead and insert into the equation the group score for the brown-haired worker, which is 14, and then we just go ahead and solve. So we're going to get 17 equals 0.5t plus 0.5 times 14 is 7. That's a weird 7. But we subtract 7 from both sides and we get 10 equals 0.5t. Now, if we divide both sides by 0.5, we find that in order for this worker to get a $17 wage like their black-haired compatriot or their black-haired competitor, they have to earn a score of 20. The problem setup says that the test scores range from 1 to 20. So in order to get the same wage, this worker has to get the best possible score, get 100% in order to get the same wage as someone who got 16 out of 20. So yeah, discrimination is present. In this case, workers with brown hair have to score a higher score on this test in order to get the same or comparable treatment as workers from the other group. And so that is, even though they're earning the same wages, they're doing it with different levels of productivity, different aptitudes, different skills, and that's discrimination. The third part of the question asks what would happen if we adjusted the weights. If we change the weights here and say instead that maybe now it's going to be 3% or 30% of the weight is on the individual test score and 70% is on the group test score, that's going to make the discrimination worse because now the individual productivity matters even less than the productivity of the whole group. And that is discrimination. And so the more that the employer puts weight on the productivity of the group or the expectations of the group, the greater the discrimination. It's going to mean more people get hired from the favored group and fewer workers from the disfavored group are hired. And when they are hired, they're going to earn lower wages. Last thing here, I got 5 minutes left to wrap this up for you guys before I have to give the classroom back. The self-selection model of immigration. The self-selection model of immigration says that, hey, some workers might be self-selecting into immigration markets based on their expected returns to skill. And so we graph it in such a way that we have workers facing two curves. And it's going to be looking at the level of skill they have and the money they expect to earn. And one curve is going to represent their home country, and one curve is going to represent another country, the country they would immigrate to, a destination. In this case, we see that workers are going to go to the country where the expectation of wages is higher. So in this case, this model is going to say that highly skilled workers will stay home and lower skilled workers will immigrate. If we switch it up, then we'll see that if the destination offers higher returns to skill than the home country, then workers who are past this threshold are going to migrate to that new country because they're going to get better returns to skill. There's more opportunity, they have the opportunity to make more money, and they're going to want to do that. And so this is this idea around the concept of brain drain, and when we see workers of different skills and education level travel, why they might be doing it. And the idea here is that workers are self-selecting individually based on what their expectations are and what their talent, skills, abilities, and really in a lot of cases human capital is. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that gives you a nice little review of those materials. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for bearing with me with this very weird screen.